The morning light spilled gently over Tulsa, Oklahoma, in the spring of 1921. The streets shimmered with dust and oil, and the distant hum of industry mixed with the laughter of children running barefoot through the alleys. Horses clattered on cobblestone, Model T Fords rumbled past storefronts, and the smell of fresh bread drifted from a bakery window. It was a city alive with promise, but divided by color and by history. On one side of the railroad tracks stood White Tulsa, booming with oil wealth, smoke, and ambition. On the other side, a world built from struggle and pride, Greenwood, known proudly to its people as Black Wall Street. Greenwood was not just a neighborhood, it was an idea made flesh, a living declaration that freedom could grow out of chains. Men in pressed suits walked beneath electric lights, tipping their hats to ladies in white gloves. Children carried school books under their arms, their shoes shining under the morning sun. Doctors, lawyers, business owners, teachers, all black, all determined, had built a community so successful that it drew travelers from across America to see it. Along Greenwood Avenue stood cafes, barbershops, tailors, hotels, newspapers, and the Dreamland Theater, where jazz bands played until the walls shook with life. The air was thick with the scent of roasted peanuts, pipe smoke, and dreams coming true. The people here were the sons and daughters of former slaves, men and women who had crossed entire states after emancipation to find land they could call their own. They had survived the lash, the chain, and the noose, and still they built. They built schools because no one else would teach their children. They built banks because no one else would trust their money. They built churches because faith was the only inheritance they had left. Every brick, every storefront, every melody of the jazz band in Dreamland was a statement to a nation that still refused to see them as equals. We are here. We are capable. We are free. Among them was O.W. Gurley, a businessman who had once stood on an empty field of red dirt and imagined a city. He bought 40 acres of land and began selling plots to black families who wanted more than survival. J.B. Stratford, a man born to parents who had once been enslaved, built a grand hotel with marble floors and chandeliers. He would stand on the balcony in his fine suit, looking down at the bustling street below, knowing that every footstep was a miracle. Booker T. Washington had called it the Negro Wall Street of America, and the name stuck, both as praise and provocation. Because south of the tracks, resentment brewed. White Tulsa's oilmen and merchants saw Greenwood's prosperity as an insult, not an inspiration. The same men who boasted of freedom and opportunity could not bear the sight of a black man driving a better car or wearing a finer coat. The color line, once drawn in dust, began to harden into something dangerous. Whispers turned to rumors. Newspapers began to write about uppity Negroes who forgot their place. And yet life in Greenwood continued to glow, fragile but fearless. On warm evenings, the sound of jazz spilled into the streets. Couples danced in the open air while laughter echoed from porches. Inside the Dreamland Theater, Henry Simmons blew his trumpet until the night itself seemed to sway. Down the street, Dick Rowland, a young shoeshine boy, wiped oil dust from his hands and looked at the lights with a heart full of hope. He had dreams of opening his own parlor one day, of wearing a tailored suit and having his name painted proudly on a shop window. Sometimes he spoke with Sarah Page, a white elevator operator from downtown. She was kind to him, and he to her, though such friendships carried the weight of danger in those years. But youth has its own kind of innocence, blind to the storm gathering at the edge of the sky. On the morning of May 30, 1921, the air was thick and heavy with heat. Dick Rowland stepped into the Drexel building downtown to take the elevator, as he did every day. Sarah Page was at her post. The elevator lurched suddenly, unsteady on its cable. and as Dick stumbled forward, his hand brushed her arm. She screamed, startled, frightened, perhaps only by the fall, and in a moment the building's clerk came running. By noon, whispers had already turned to accusation. A colored boy attacked a white girl, tried to hurt her, said another. The truth, simple and fragile, was crushed beneath the weight of fear and hate. Dick Rowland was arrested that afternoon. By evening, the Tulsa Tribune published a story under a headline that burned like a match: "Nab Negro for attacking girl in elevator." The article spoke of lynching, of mob justice, of vengeance. Outside the courthouse, white men began to gather, armed and restless. Across the tracks, word reached Greenwood. They had seen this before, in Texas, in Georgia, in Mississippi, where accusations turned to blood and trees became gallows. The men of Greenwood decided they would not let it happen again. That night, a group of black veterans, many of them soldiers who had fought for the United States and France during the Great War, marched toward the courthouse with rifles on their shoulders. They came not to fight, but to protect. They remembered the trenches of Europe, where they had worn the same uniform as white men and bled for the same flag. They remembered the promise whispered to them when the war ended: equality, respect, a new beginning. But America had forgotten that promise. Now they would not forget themselves. Outside the courthouse, the crowd had grown into hundreds. The white mob jeered and spat. A sheriff's deputy tried to keep order, but the anger had taken its own shape, a living thing made of fear and pride. One white man tried to take a black soldier's gun, and a shot rang out. The night froze, and then exploded. What followed was chaos. The mob turned savage, shooting wildly, dragging men from cars, setting fire to anything that moved. The black defenders retreated north toward Greenwood, firing as they went. By dawn, the city was at war with itself. White men stormed into Greenwood with torches and rifles, burning homes, looting stores, dragging families into the streets. Airplanes circled overhead, dropping firebombs made of kerosene and turpentine, the first time American citizens had ever been attacked from the air by their own. Smoke rose in black pillars, blotting out the morning sun. The Dreamland Theater was reduced to ashes. The Stratford Hotel collapsed in flame. Men were shot in their doorways. Women fled barefoot with children in their arms. The smell of oil and blood filled the air. By noon on June 1st, Tulsa, Black Wall Street, was gone. 35 blocks of homes, businesses, churches, and schools lay in ruins. Nearly 10,000 people were left homeless. The official death toll would later claim around 30, but survivors knew it was far higher. Bodies were thrown into mass graves, some into the Arkansas River, erased as if their lives had never been. The National Guard arrived too late, and when they did, they arrested the victims instead of the killers. Thousands of black citizens were marched at gunpoint to detention camps, forced to wear identification tags like prisoners of war. The men who had built a city from dust now stood among its ashes, watching smoke curl up into the same sky that had once carried their music. In the days that followed, Tulsa's white newspapers called it a riot. They said the Negroes had started it, that they had gotten what they deserved. Insurance companies refused to pay claims, citing riot clauses. The city passed new zoning laws designed to keep Greenwood from ever rebuilding. The silence that followed was deliberate and deep. For decades, history textbooks would not mention it. Children in Tulsa would grow up not knowing that their city had once destroyed its own heart. But survivors remembered. They rebuilt with bare hands, laying new foundations over the scorched earth. Churches rose again, schools reopened in basements. The jazz returned, softer now, but still alive. An old man named Henry Simmons, his trumpet scorched black from fire, played one final song in the ruins of Dreamland. He called it "The City That Still Breathes." He played it for the dead, for the forgotten, for every dream that refused to die. Years later, when the city tried to pretend it had never happened, the ground itself began to whisper.
Archaeologists found the graves, the bullets, the charred bricks. The truth, buried for a century, began to rise. America looked again into the mirror of 1921 and saw what it had tried to hide. Greenwood had been more than a place. It had been proof. Proof that a people once enslaved could build an empire of hope, that wealth and dignity could bloom even in a land poisoned by hate. And though fire took the buildings, it could not take the memory. The spirit of Black Wall Street lived on, in every dreamer who refused to bow, in every note of jazz that rose against silence, and every hand that still reached toward tomorrow. The city burned, but the people endured, for even in ashes, Greenwood still stood.
The days after the massacre were a blur of smoke and silence. The streets that had once pulsed with laughter and jazz were now blackened bones of a dream. The smell of burnt wood and oil hung heavy in the air. Charred pianos lay twisted in the rubble of dance halls, their keys melted into silence. The wind carried whispers of prayers from the makeshift camps where thousands of displaced families huddled under tents. Tulsa was no longer two cities divided by the tracks. It was one vast grave of shame. In the detention centers, at the fairgrounds and the convention hall, the survivors sat on cots, staring blankly into space. Mothers searched for children. Husbands called for wives. No one knew how many were dead or who had disappeared into the flames. Soldiers with rifles patrolled the aisles, barking orders. Every black person in those camps had to carry a tag, a small white card around their necks stamped prisoner. Their only crime was surviving. Old men whispered Bible verses to calm the young ones. Women washed their faces with rainwater, straightened their backs, and refused to let despair win. "We've seen worse," one woman said quietly, her hands trembling as she braided her daughter's hair. "We came through slavery. We'll come through this too." But beneath their courage lay something deeper, the sting of betrayal. They had believed in America. They had fought for its freedom, paid its taxes, obeyed its laws. And still, when the mob came, no one had come for them. The same police who had promised to protect them had joined the looters. Some had even fired their guns at the very people they were sworn to defend. Greenwood's ashes were proof that the promise of equality had been a lie, written in ink that burned too easily. In the ruins of the Stratford Hotel, the air still shimmered with heat. J.B. Stratford, once the proud owner of Tulsa's grandest building, walked through what was left of his empire. He had been arrested days earlier, accused of inciting a riot. He was released only after paying a heavy bond, his fortune gone. Now he stood barefoot among the wreckage, holding a piece of scorched wallpaper between his fingers. It crumbled like ash. "They couldn't stand to see us succeed," he whispered to himself. "But we will again. God help me, we will again." Down the street, Reverend C.R. Brown stood before the ruins of Mount Zion Baptist Church. Only the stone foundation remained, blackened and broken. The congregation gathered around him, hundreds of souls dressed in soot and sorrow. He raised his arms toward the sky, his voice breaking, but strong. He said, "We will rebuild this church, not for them to see, but for us to remember. For every brick they burned, we will lay two more. For every soul they tried to erase, we will speak their names." And the people answered in one trembling voice, "Amen." But rebuilding was not easy. The city of Tulsa did everything it could to stop them. Officials passed new ordinances forbidding wooden homes in the burned district, knowing full well that brick was too expensive for most survivors. Insurance companies denied all claims, calling the destruction a riot instead of an act of terror. Banks refused to lend money. And yet, night after night, men and women returned to their ruins with hammers, nails, and faith. They slept in tents beside the foundations of their former homes. They rebuilt by hand, one wall at a time, under the glow of lanterns and stars. By the end of the year, The first new houses began to rise. The laughter of children returned to the streets, though quieter now, touched by the memory of screams. The Greenwood district, the same neighborhood that had been erased, began to breathe again. It was smaller, scarred, but alive.
For decades, no newspaper mentioned it again. Schools did not teach it. History books called it a disturbance if they mentioned it at all. Entire generations grew up walking on streets built over the bones of Greenwood, never knowing what lay beneath their feet. The silence was deliberate, a pact of amnesia signed by guilt and shame. But silence does not erase truth, it only delays it. In the 1960s, as the civil rights movement swept across America, a few voices began to speak again. An old woman named Olivia Hooker, who had been 6 years old when the massacre happened, told reporters what she remembered: the soldiers setting fire to her home, the machine guns on the hill. Her story cracked open the silence like a bell in a dark room. Others followed. Slowly, the hidden history began to surface. Journalists and historians started digging through archives, finding faded photographs, burned documents, letters written in trembling hands. The official death count of 35 became a cruel joke. The real number, they discovered, was likely in the hundreds. They found mass graves on the outskirts of the city, unmarked and unacknowledged. The dead had been buried without names, without prayers, without justice. And yet, even as the truth returned, the city of Tulsa resisted. Apologies came late and hollow. Reparations were debated, denied, delayed. The survivors, old and tired, stood before cameras and spoke softly. "We built it once, you burned it down, and now you say we must move on." But they never truly could. For them, the smell of smoke never left the air. In the 21st century, a new generation began to dig, literally. Ground-penetrating radar revealed the outlines of bodies beneath the soil. Scientists uncovered bones wrapped in burlap, bullets still lodged in the earth. Each discovery was a ghost demanding to be seen. The world finally began to look, to listen, to learn. But the legacy of Greenwood is not only tragedy, it is also triumph. Out of ashes came artists, teachers, preachers, doctors, descendants of the survivors who refused to disappear. They carried the memory like a torch, lighting the way for those who would come after. In the rebuilt Greenwood, new shops opened, murals rose on walls, and the jazz returned once more, carried by the wind. Every year now, in the month of May, people gather in Tulsa to honor the lost. They read the names that could be found, and they stand in silence for the names that never were. The air fills with the sound of trumpets, echoing across the streets where once the fires burned. The song is not one of mourning alone, but of defiance. The same melody Henry Simmons played in the ruins long ago. The city that still breathes. And so the story of Greenwood lives on, not as a wound, but as a warning, a reminder of what hate can destroy, and what love, faith, and memory can rebuild. The soil of Tulsa may still hold its dead, but above it, life grows again. Children play in the parks. Families open small businesses. Old men tell stories under the fading sun. And every night, when the wind moves through the trees, it carries a whisper that sounds like a promise. They tried to burn us down, but we are still here.
Years turned into decades, and the ashes of Greenwood settled beneath the city like dust that would never blow away. The survivors aged quietly, carrying the weight of what they had seen in their eyes. Their children grew up hearing fragments of stories, whispered warnings, half-finished sentences, the sound of fear hidden between words. Most of them learned early not to ask too many questions. When they did, their mothers would shake their heads and say softly, "Some things are too heavy to speak, baby." But silence has a strange power. It keeps pain alive even when memory fades. In the 1930s, the Great Depression came, and Tulsa changed again. Skyscrapers rose downtown, oil money flooded back into the white part of the city, and Greenwood, scarred but stubborn, tried to breathe. The people rebuilt the stores, opened cafes again, brought music back to the nights. But the glitter that once made it Black Wall Street was gone. Wealth had turned into endurance. Men worked long hours as janitors and carpenters. Women took in laundry, cooked for white families, raised other people's children while their own waited at home. Still, they carried dignity like a second skin. They refused to vanish. At Mount Zion Baptist Church, rebuilt from the ruins, the same hymns were sung in cracked voices. The new pews were made of rough wood, the paint thin, but when the sunlight hit the stained glass, it lit the room like fire. The congregation still believed that faith could turn suffering into strength. "We were forged in flame," Reverend Jackson said one Sunday morning, "and what fire forges no man can destroy." His words were not poetry, they were survival. By the 1940s, America went to war again, and the sons of Greenwood marched off in uniforms that looked just like the ones their fathers had worn in France. They fought the Nazis in Europe while Jim Crow ruled their homes. Letters came back across the ocean filled with pride and anger. "We're fighting for freedom abroad," one soldier wrote, "but we still can't sit in the same restaurants at home." When those men returned, medals on their chests, they stepped off the trains in Tulsa to find the same walls still standing, invisible but unbroken. Yet something inside them had changed. They were no longer willing to bow their heads. In the 1950s, the civil rights movement began to stir. From Montgomery to Birmingham, voices rose demanding the equality promised in the Constitution. Greenwood listened. Some joined marches. Others simply watched and prayed. But Tulsa remained quiet, too quiet. The massacre had taught them what white rage could do. For many, silence still felt like safety. The city's white leaders pretended Greenwood was healed. The newspapers spoke of progress, of unity, of forgetting the past. But beneath the surface, the wound still bled. Then came the 1960s, and with it, change. The highways arrived, concrete rivers slicing through cities, built in the name of modernity. In Tulsa, the new I-244 expressway cut straight through Greenwood's heart. Bulldozers leveled blocks of homes and shops that had survived the fire of 1921. The government called it urban renewal. The people of Greenwood called it what it was, a second destruction. Businesses closed, families moved away. The district that had once symbolized Black pride was reduced again to memory. And yet, some refused to let that memory die. Teachers began to collect stories from elders who remembered the smoke, the gunfire, the screams. They wrote them down in notebooks, passed them to their students, and said, "This is who we are. Don't let them tell you it never happened." Among those students was a boy named Marcus, whose grandmother had survived the massacre as a child. She had told him once while shelling peas on the porch, "They burned our world, but they didn't burn our soul." Those words stayed with him. Marcus grew up, became a writer, and in the 1980s he began to publish essays about the massacre, stories that Tulsa still didn't want to hear. He wrote about the airplanes, the mass graves, the silence. He wrote about his grandmother's eyes, which had seen both the flames and the rebuilding. Some called him a liar. Some called him brave. He kept writing anyway. And slowly, the country began to listen. By the 1990s, researchers and journalists were uncovering the buried truth. Old photographs surfaced, rows of burned bodies, soldiers standing with rifles, the smoldering bones of Black Wall Street. People who were children in 1921 began to speak on record for the first time. They described the airplanes, the bombs, the men in uniforms who helped the mob. They remembered the sound of a piano burning, the way the air glowed red like sunset at midnight. One woman said, "I saw the end of the world, and then I saw it start again." Her testimony spread across America, and suddenly the story that had been buried for 70 years was alive again. In 1996, the state of Oklahoma finally formed a commission to investigate the massacre. Historians dug into archives, forensic teams searched for graves. The findings were undeniable. Hundreds killed, thousands displaced, 35 blocks erased from history. The report concluded that the event was not a riot, as the old newspapers had claimed, but a massacre, a word that fit like a blade. The truth, long hidden, had found its name. Still, justice did not come. The survivors, by then in their 80s and 90s, testified before lawmakers, their hands trembling, their voices steady. They asked for reparations, not out of greed, but dignity. "We lost everything," one man said, "and then we were told to forget." We never did. But the government offered words instead of restitution. The promises faded like smoke once more. Even so, the world had changed. Schools began to teach the story. Museums were built. In Greenwood, a new generation opened cafes and bookstores on the same streets where their ancestors had once walked. Murals of hope covered the walls. Faces of the lost painted 10 feet tall, gazing out over a city that had finally begun to remember. Tourists came to learn, to stand on the ground where Black Wall Street once thrived. Some wept, some stood in silence. The ghosts of Greenwood seemed to whisper through the wind, not in sorrow, but in pride. Marcus, now an old man himself, returned to the spot where his grandmother's house had once stood. The air smelled of rain, and the faint hum of traffic rolled from the highway nearby. He knelt and touched the soil, dark, rich, and alive. He said, "They thought fire could erase us, but it only planted us deeper." Around him, children laughed, their voices bright as sunlight. He smiled. The city that once burned had found its heartbeat again. Every May, the people of Tulsa gather at the memorial. Candles flicker in the night. Trumpets play the same notes that once poured from dreamland's windows. The old survivors sit enwrapped in blankets, eyes shining with memory. The young listen, their faces lit by flame and faith. No one speaks for a long time. Then someone starts to sing, low and trembling at first, then stronger, rising with the wind. "We shall overcome." The song moves through the crowd, through the streets, through the city that tried to forget and finally remembered. And somewhere in the distance, where the river bends and the trees lean toward the sky, the spirits of Greenwood breathe again. They are not angry anymore. They are watching. They are waiting. They are home.
In the early 2000s, the city of Tulsa began to stir again. Not from fire this time, but from memory. For decades, the massacre had lived like a rumor, whispered only in kitchens and church basements. Now it returned like a ghost demanding to be seen. Reporters came from across the country. Historians reopened the archives. And the state of Oklahoma, reluctant and trembling, finally agreed to look back at its own shadow. They called it the Tulsa Race Riot Commission, though the word riot still burned on the tongue like a lie. To the descendants of Greenwood, it had never been a riot. It was a slaughter. But for the first time, the government promised to investigate what had really happened in those 2 terrible days of 1921. Old survivors came forward, their faces lined like maps, their eyes still carrying the reflection of flames. They told stories they had buried for 80 years. "They came with guns," one woman said softly. "And when the shooting started, I was just a little girl hiding under the bed. I could smell my daddy's shop burning. The air was thick with smoke and screams. It never left me. The commission listened. The newspapers wrote. America, at last, began to hear. As investigators dug through city records, the evidence piled up. Insurance claims denied to black families. Police reports that vanished. Bodies dumped in unmarked graves. Aerial photographs showed the scope of the devastation. A thriving neighborhood turned to cinder overnight. The official report, released in 2001, called the event what it truly was: a massacre and a crime against humanity. The report recommended reparations, not just apologies, but financial justice, scholarships for descendants, economic support for rebuilding Greenwood, direct payments to survivors who were still alive. But when the recommendation reached the state legislature, it was met with silence. Too expensive, they said. Too long ago. Too complicated. The survivors watched from the gallery as their hopes, once again, were buried under politics. Yet something had changed. The truth was no longer underground. The fire that had destroyed Greenwood now burned in the public conscience. By 2010, Tulsa's skyline had changed again. Glass towers and art museums gleamed downtown. The Greenwood district, once reduced to rubble and highways, began to rise in a new form. Young entrepreneurs opened cafes and bookshops, naming them after the old businesses: Dreamland, Williams & Son Clothiers, the Liberty Cafe. On the walls, murals bloomed, faces of the victims, painted in color and light. At night, jazz returned. Saxophones cried from open doors. People danced where their grandparents had once fled. The sound was not denial, it was defiance. Across the country, artists, filmmakers, and historians began to tell the story. Documentaries aired on national television. College courses taught the massacre as part of American history. The silence that had lasted 70 years was finally broken. Then came 2020, the year of reckoning. The streets of America filled again with voices chanting for justice after the killing of George Floyd. The cry of Black Lives Matter echoed in Tulsa, too, and people gathered under the hot Oklahoma sun, carrying signs that read, "Remember Greenwood." The old and the young stood side by side, the descendants of survivors holding pictures of their ancestors. That summer, the city government announced a new search for mass graves. Technology had improved. Ground-penetrating radar could now peer into the soil that had hidden its secrets for a century. They found anomalies, shapes beneath the earth where the records said none should exist. When the excavation began, the first bones appeared, white and fragile as truth itself. The city paused. The news spread. For days, people came and stood at the edge of the dig site, silent, heads bowed. Some prayed. Some wept. One old man whispered, "We told them they were here." The bones were carefully lifted up, one by one, and laid into boxes lined with white cloth. Forensic experts examined them. Men, women, children. Bullets still lodged in ribs. Fragments of jewelry, buttons, a child's shoe. Each discovery tore open the wound again, but it also gave peace. The dead were no longer lost. At the Greenwood Cultural Center, candles burned all night. Survivors' descendants gathered to speak their names. One woman read from a list, her voice trembling. Henry Williams, Sarah Goodwin, baby Robert Jones. The crowd repeated each name, one after another, until the hall filled with echoes, the sound of memory refusing to fade. In 2021, on the centennial of the massacre, Tulsa stood before the mirror of its past. The President of the United States came to Greenwood to speak. The The survivors, just 3 still alive, sat in the front row, their hands folded in their laps, their eyes clear. "We are not ghosts," one of them said. "We are the evidence." The president's voice carried over the crowd. What happened here was not a riot. It was an act of hatred, and it was followed by silence. But silence is no longer an option. The audience rose in applause and tears. It was not justice yet, but it was acknowledgement. After the ceremony, the survivors' families walked through the streets of Greenwood. They saw school children painting murals of hope, young musicians performing in the park, small businesses bearing names like Freedom Cafe and Resilient Roots. The air smelled of barbecue and magnolia. The ghosts of the past seemed to linger in the corners, not as shadows, but as guardians. That night, the old district glowed with candles and music. A choir sang from the steps of the rebuilt Mount Zion Baptist Church. The same hymn that had once been sung amid ashes now rose into the open sky. Amazing grace, how sweet the sound! And there, among the crowd, Marcus, the writer who had spent his life telling Greenwood's story, stood watching. His eyes filled with tears as he looked around. For the first time in a century, people were not running from the truth. They were walking toward it. He thought of his grandmother's words. "They burned our world, but they didn't burn our soul." Now he understood what she meant. The fire had tried to erase them, but it had also forged something unbreakable. The will to endure, to rebuild, to remember. As the choir's song drifted into the night, Marcus closed his notebook for the last time. He had written every word, traced every memory. The story of Greenwood was no longer a secret. It was America's. And somewhere deep beneath the city, in the soil that had once hidden so much sorrow, the bones of the lost rested quietly. Not forgotten, not alone. The city above them pulsed with life again. Laughter, music, the smell of food and rain. Greenwood lived. And that, after everything, was victory enough.
In the years after the centennial, Tulsa began to look different, not just in the skyline or the buildings, but in its soul. The city that had once buried its own history started to breathe in rhythm with the truth. Greenwood, long reduced to a memory, was alive again, not as it had been in 1921, but as something new, a living memorial, a community reborn from ashes and silence. On Greenwood Avenue, the morning sun fell across murals that stretched for blocks, faces of the past painted larger than life. Children on their way to school passed beneath the gaze of their ancestors, their laughter echoing through streets that had once burned. Cafes opened early, the smell of coffee and sweetbread spilling into the air. A bookstore called The Phoenix stood near the old Dreamland Theater lot, its sign painted gold and black with words on the window, "From fire we rise." Inside that shop, college students studied history not as distant tragedy, but as inheritance. They read about the massacre, about the rebuilding, about the fight for justice that had stretched across a century. One of them, a young woman named Alana, often sat at the back table, her laptop open, her hands trembling with purpose. She was the great-great-granddaughter of a Greenwood survivor. Her project was simple: to collect every name, every face, every lost story, to build a digital archive so that no one could ever erase them again. At night, she'd walk through the Greenwood Cultural Center, now expanded and gleaming with glass and light. Exhibits showed photographs, artifacts, and testimonies, but also art, poetry, and film from new voices who refused to let the past be just pain. "This," she said once during a speech to her classmates, "is not just Black history. This is American history. This is human history. And if we don't protect memory, we lose meaning." Across the country, schools began to teach the Tulsa Race Massacre as part of their official curriculum. Documentaries aired on major networks. Musicians sampled old jazz tracks from Greenwood in their songs. Painters reimagined the city's skyline, half in fire, half in gold. The nation that had once turned its face away now turned toward Tulsa, seeking to understand how beauty and horror could coexist in one story. Meanwhile, in Tulsa itself, something deeper was happening. A quiet reconciliation. For the first time, white residents began to attend remembrance ceremonies, not as outsiders, but as witnesses. They stood beside black families at candlelight vigils, heads bowed, tears falling freely. "I didn't know," one man whispered to an elder. The woman nodded gently and replied, "You know now. That's how it starts." The movement for reparations had not died either. Legal battles continued. Historians, lawyers, and activists filed new cases on behalf of the last surviving descendants. They argued that time did not erase theft, that justice delayed was still justice owed. Courts debated, politicians hesitated, but the public pressure grew. If America can spend billions remembering its victories, it can afford to honor the people it destroyed. Money was not the only form of repair. The city created the Greenwood Rising Museum, a towering structure of steel and light that rose exactly where smoke had once filled the sky. Inside, visitors walked through rooms of immersive history, holograms of survivors telling their stories, recreated streets of Black Wall Street before the fire, and a dark tunnel where the sounds of the massacre played softly, hauntingly, reminding each visitor of what hatred could do when left unchecked. At the end of the tunnel was light, a space of renewal, filled with the laughter of children and the hum of music. Outside, a garden bloomed, hundreds of flowers, each representing a lost life. When the wind blew, it carried the scent of magnolia and the faint sound of church bells. Weddings were held there now, so were poetry nights. The garden had become sacred ground, not for mourning, but for rebirth. By 2030, a new generation of entrepreneurs had transformed Greenwood once again. Tech startups, design studios, and cultural nonprofits filled the same streets that once held barbershops and law offices a century ago. The name Black Wall Street returned, this time not just as nostalgia, but as a blueprint for the future. Investors came from across America, not to take, but to build alongside. For the first time in living memory, Greenwood was not defined by what it had lost, but by what it had become. Marcus, the old writer, had passed away a few years earlier. At his funeral, they read from his final essay, one he'd written just before his death. "History is not a wound to be hidden. It is a scar that reminds us we survived. Greenwood burned once, but it was never destroyed. It lived in every heartbeat that refused to forget." His grave lay beneath a large oak tree overlooking Greenwood Avenue. On his headstone were just two words: "Still here." Alana visited often. Sometimes she'd sit in the grass and read aloud the stories she had collected, more than 2,000 of them by then, names and dreams once thought lost forever. "You're heard now, all of you." As night fell, the lights of modern Tulsa shimmered on the horizon. The highway that had once cut Greenwood in half now had murals painted along its concrete walls, scenes of unity, of fire and rebirth, of faces rising from smoke like dawn. Cars passed by, their headlights flickering across the words painted in bold letters: "We remember." Every year on May 31st, the people gathered again. They held candles, sang old songs, told new stories. Children ran through the crowd, their laughter mingling with the hum of prayer. Elders sat in folding chairs, eyes bright with both sorrow and pride. When the final hymn began, "We Shall Overcome," it rose into the warm night air, echoing across the city that had once tried to erase them. And as the music drifted upward,
The spirits of Greenwood seemed to listen. The men who had built it, the women who had rebuilt it, the children who had dreamed beyond it. They no longer cried, they no longer hid. They watched as life, their life, continued in color and song. Tulsa would never be the same. America would never be the same. The fire that once destroyed had, in its strange way, also illuminated, revealing what was broken, what was cruel, but also what could be healed. Because Greenwood was never just a place, it was an idea, that freedom could thrive even where hate once ruled, that light could be born from ashes, and that memory, once awakened, can never be buried again. And in the stillness of that final night, as candles flickered against the Oklahoma sky, it seemed that even the stars themselves bowed low, reflecting the glow of the living below, 1,000 tiny flames refusing to go out. Greenwood had risen, and this time it would never fall again.